This is a history hot tip. The Man in the Iron Mask was an infamous prisoner who spent the last 34 years of his life incarcerated in the Bastille and never knew why. He died believing he was a victim of mistaken identity. But what if I told you that? What if I told you that this guy really did have a name, and it was uneven that secret? The papers called him the Iron Mask. We know because we can read the records. And if you want to learn more about the real name of the Man in the Iron Mask, well, you've come to the right place. It's like many famous historical mysteries. There are two parts to the story of the Man in the Iron Mask: the legend and the reality. And while the reality is way less interesting, it is definitely worth telling because it's full of intrigue and murder. So let me set the stage. We're going to begin our tale in Paris in the year 1669. Louis XIV has been King of France for 16 years and is arguably at the height of his power. The country's cultural influence is greater than ever, and the king himself is considered something of a heartthrob with women. I mean women fawning over him. This is not your typical image of a medieval monarch. And so, in order to keep up with his public image, Louis goes to great lengths to control how he is portrayed in art. This is important because while Louis might be considered a heartthrob by most, there are some artists whose depictions of him are considered a bit too flattering and thus unacceptable. Such is the case with one artist named Pierre Mignard, who had painted a portrait of the king that the royal court found too handsome. The king apparently hated it. And so in 1669, Louis commissioned another artist named Hyacinthe Rigaud to paint his official portrait. And you might recognize this one because it's still hanging in the Louvre today. It's actually the official French royal portrait and is used on all their coinage. But back to 1669, when it was new, the painting was deemed perfect, and Rigaud was handsomely rewarded. There were rumors that he slept with the king's mistress to secure the commission, but that's just gossip. What is fact is that he was commissioned to make copies of the painting to send to foreign dignitaries as gifts. And this is where the scandal begins. See, Rigaud didn't make the copies himself. Instead, he had them made by his assistants in his own style. Some historians say these copies were essentially forgeries, but I don't think that's fair because Rigaud wasn't trying to dupe anyone. Rather, he was simply subcontracting the work to meet demand. And so he had no choice but to train other artists in his style and then send them off to do the actual paintings. One of those artists was an engraver named Jean Garrick, who was sent to Spain to make a copy of the portrait for King Philip IV. But after finishing the work, Gerard was detained by Spanish authorities on suspicion of being a spy. They threw him in prison and forced him to wear an iron mask, which was supposedly to prevent him from escaping or killing himself. But either way, Gerard ended up dying in prison in 1676, without ever finding out. Why? The Spanish thought he was a spy. Now Gerard was only in prison for 7 years, but they kept his body until 1687, before finally releasing it back to France. Once they had the body, the French authorities put Gerard to a pretty weird test. They dug up the corpse, weighed it, measured it, and then recorded the results in a series of wax seals. These wax seals, by the way, are still around today and are kept in the archives of the French National Library. They read literally the closest thing that we have to the bones of the Man in the Iron Mask. But anyways, once they had Gerard's measurements, the French government went to great lengths to cover up the fact that it was him. In fact, they released a statement claiming that the body they had unearthed belonged to someone completely different. A guy named Bont, who was supposedly a known criminal. Then, they reburied Bonat's body in Paris, held Gerard's measurements in a state archive, and even made sure to record Bonat's measurements in case anyone thought to look there. So obviously this seems like a huge cover-up and a huge waste of time for such a minor crime, especially since nobody seems to know anything about this Bont guy. I mean, the whole story doesn't seem to make any sense. But the reason that the French government went to such great lengths to cover up Gerard's identity was because they didn't want anyone to know that their beloved artist had died in prison. Why? Well, this next part is going to make it all make sense. Because after Gerard died, Rigaud continued to live in luxury in Paris, painting portraits of the king and sleeping with the king's mistresses. In fact, he continued to live in luxury until he died in 1742. 34 years later, he never once visited Gerard in prison, never once asked about his whereabouts, and never once seemed to care that his apprentice had been languishing in a dark cell for no apparent reason. And so that was the mystery of the Man in the Iron Mask, or at least it was, until 1976, when a French historian named Emmanuel Lié claimed that the man in the iron mask was un-Gerard at all, but rather a nobleman named Eustace Stajar. According to Lecomte, Eustache de Jaucourt was the son of the Sun King's former mistress, and had been arrested on the orders of the current mistress. In prison, they locked him up in the Bastille and never told him why, though he probably figured it out at some point. Since Lecomte claims that Eustache died believing that Rigaud had betrayed him to save his own skin, while Lecomte's theory is more romantic than the truth, it's not true. It's not only is there zero evidence to support his claim, but he also contradicts himself because in his book, Lecomte says that Jacquard died in the mid-1670s. Yet in the acknowledgments, he thanks the French National Library for allowing him to study the wax seal that recorded Jacquard's measurements. And as we already discussed, that seal was made in 1687. And speaking of 1687, that was the same year that Rigaud made a painting of Jacquard and gifted it to the Sun King. So that might explain why Louis kept up the charade that Gerard was boned, because he didn't want people to know that he owned a painting of Jacquard. But here's the problem. It still doesn't make any sense because Louis didn't become the Sun King until 1673. And as far as I can tell, there is absolutely zero evidence that the man in the iron mask was ever even called Eustache Dogger. Now, there are other candidates that historians have put forward, such as Condé de Vermandois, the Sun King's nephew, or even Cardinal Mazarin, the Sun King's chief minister, but none of them fit the bill either. For instance, Condé was imprisoned in the Bastille in 1653 for trying to kill his brother, and he was visited by Rigaud in 1664, which would make it impossible for him to be the man in the iron mask. Meanwhile, Mazarin died in 1661, which makes him yet another unlikely candidate. So to answer the question posed in this video, yes, the man in the iron mask did indeed have a name. His name was Jean Girard, and it was well known at the time, although it has been lost to history since the French government wanted everyone to believe that he was someone else. Well, I can't solve every mystery. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. And that was certainly the case for the man in the iron mask. In this case, the cover-up was more extensive than the crime, and in the end, the main perpetrator got away scot-free. But now you know the truth. Thanks for watching.